don't sit down and sort of say, okay, I want to, you know, use my education for something.
Yeah.
But when you get into something that you're doing, that background, it's like a reservoir that you can draw on. Um, and in fact, even now, I have written, I really like the sonnet form and also the villanelle, which is another of the art of kneading is a villanelle. But which also is a pentameter
Oh
line, by
my.
the way. So yeah, but when I'm working with material, if I'm seeing that a pentameter line works, I will begin thinking, is this a sonnet or could it be a sonnet? Because it needs a certain arc and shape. It's going to be, sonnets. You can cheat some. There have been 16 line sonnets and 12 line sonnets, but still, if it's I ask myself, is it moving toward that form? And if it is, then I begin making word choices. I begin to play with the form in the material and see if I can make it work as a sonnet. Sometimes it doesn't fit.
Mhm.
It's better. It's the wrong container, the wrong form. But um, yeah.
And I I liked how you said like the um to paraphrase or maybe butcher it, I'm not sure.
Huh.
But the form kind of comes out, like the material is there,
Yeah.
but the form comes out. So I wanted to maybe use that as a segue to the idea that this dichotomy almost between the East and the West in
Mm, mm,
this chapbook.
mm,
So the I had to Google a lot of the images
mm, mm,
in this book, and there's like references to songs that I had
mm,
found googling these things, and I feel like the images, both from like the eastern settings and the more desert west
mhm,
settings, they're both peaceful, but I think that the western imagery, like um, the night blooming cereus, is that how
serious,
cereus,
serious. Mhm.
in on a dim morning in our family room. I think that those are used almost for like they seem a little bit unsettling with the
Mhm.
content that we're talking about. So was that
Mhm.
something that you realized while writing, or is that something that just kind of came out and then showed itself to you?
Okay, that is interesting. We'll set the serious aside for a
Okay.
moment, but I can see how you would make that connection. But yeah, the desert poems really came out of that first experience in 2004 when. I mean, as a kid, I went out west with my parents, so I had sort of driven through deserts, but I had not spent any real time in the desert. And we spent about 10 days um, that February in the desert. And I was working that semester in a poetry seminar. I was writing poems. I was writing every day, I was writing a lot. And the environment, it was so different.
Yeah.
Especially, I was actually up in Michigan that semester. My husband was teaching at the University of Michigan that semester, and I was on sabbatical, so I was free to go be
Mhm.
with him. And we had never lived, well, we lived in the north, but not in a place that had that much snow,
Yeah.
was that cold as Michigan. I mean, we got there on the 3rd of January in a snowstorm, and we did not see a single blade of grass until February the 28th. I mean, there was snow on the ground all the time, fascinating. I mean, I wrote a lot of poems about that too. But to go from that environment to the desert, where it was warmer. I mean, everything was different, the plant life, the color palette, the earth tones. And the retreat center where we were staying had a good library of materials about the desert. And I mean, I had never lived among saguaros. They're the cactus that have the arms up,
Hmm.
if you look them up. But
Yes.
I mean, and there were paths all through there. So we were living and working in silence most of the day. And I'm also a photographer, so I was out there with my camera a lot too. But it's like every day, I mean, every minute, it was sort of like finding oneself on another planet, and just fascinating to me, both, um, you know, physically and spiritually. And uh, I think what happens when you are thrust into a very new environment, suddenly your senses are so heightened, you're really noticing things. And so I got every morning those 10 days, I was up before dawn and out. And it was always, the light was always different. The clouds were different. What was, the movement in the air was different every single morning. And so I was really noticing things and those poems. So, I mean, I'm standing there at sunrise at a retreat center, which was a religious based center. So, even though I wasn't there on an official religious retreat, I certainly seemed to be there on a spiritual retreat. And that's when it, standing out there, that first line, if an angel is to come to me, I think it would have to happen in this landscape. That came to me right there because, I mean, I don't mean to say that we couldn't feel the angel here, but I've lived many years and I love the green and the woods and, the spring in Kentucky and all the seasons here. It's my home, but there's something about the desert too that's, it's sometimes called thin space because it's less cluttered. In the East we have the green is because so many things grow and we have moisture and we have humidity and we have mold. We have a lot of things that kind of, grab you in. If you don't keep nature under some control, it will overrun. Well, the desert just perks along. It's filled more with dying things than growing. It's open. The sky is always there. It's you never a day like this, you would never have this in the desert. You might have a storm, but then it would stop storming, and it would be a big storm and then it would go away. So your sense of connection to the universe is really heightened there, especially if it's new to you. I'm sure folks who live out there don't feel it as strongly necessarily. But a lot of spiritual tradition, the Desert Fathers, and a lot of spiritual tradition takes place in the desert. So I think that's sort of what all came together there for me, and in that in the different poems about that writing. So I think the tension is probably partly due to the strangeness, which made me look so closely. And then also, though, the strangeness of the language, because I didn't know those words either. I'd never, I mean, I knew the word cactus, but I don't think I would have said cholla, and
Yeah.
I didn't know. And I learned this terminology like the aureole, which is the little, if you look closely at the cactus, a spine will come out, and then right where I mean, these are tiny little spines, but they're all over. Right where it comes out, there is a little circle where it connected to the flesh of the cactus, and that's the aureole. So I was reading books that had this language. It was wow. A word like scree. I never had heard that word. The scree is like the little pebbly stuff. A wash is like a wide space in the desert where when the spring rains come, the storms, and the water comes down, suddenly it goes to the lowest place, and that's a wash. But in February, there wasn't any water in them, you see, but they're good places to walk. So it was that strangeness and the beauty of the language. I just wanted to bathe in it. I wanted to revel in it. So that's why in something like Anatomy of the Desert, it really was learning a vocabulary that was an awe-inspiring process to me.
So, kind of using that strangeness as a way to find out new things about yourself on this
Yes.
spiritual journey.
Mm-hmm.
And that kind of relates to another question that I had about craft. I know that you write, or at least lead retreats in naturey settings, like the Abbey of Gethsemane. Is that how you say it? So do you tend to, do you stay inside sometimes and write, or is it always, because it's so flooded with just beautiful imagery of even just the page that I'm just randomly turn to the wolf spider scuttling on strong, quick legs,
Mm-hmm.
Magnolia's leaf curls. There's two images just in that
Mm-hmm.
stanza. And so, do you ever find yourself like craving to go outside if you're inside
Mm-hmm.
with writing and things like that?
Well, you know that's a good question, because I think nature is powerful inspiration and teacher, but I also see, so spending time in nature for me is a crucial thing. Where I physically then do the writing doesn't seem as important, but it is important that I have a very visceral contact with it. That as I say, when I was in the desert, I was walking every day. And I mean, sometimes I would just stand up from the desk and just go right out and, touch rocks and put them in my hands. And then the photographs too were also a way of, connecting me, because then I would look at the images and see things in the images. So it's the storing up of the sensory data from nature, and the feelings that come with being in nature is what's really important. And we will get back to the serious, by the way.
Okay.
But the poem, The First Spring Back in Kentucky, so see, that was actually written after that semester, a year after I had been in Michigan for the year. When I got back to Kentucky that year, so I'm in Michigan, it's snowy,
Mhm.
I have all of the winter, and then, but spend the time in the desert and understand how meaningful that was to me. And then we came back to Kentucky, but it was about the middle of May. So I missed spring that year. It was the next spring, my first spring back in Kentucky, that I was literally standing here. The tree that is right there has it's a kind of crabapple. It is filled with the white blossoms.
Mhm.
It was stunning to me. I mean, I truly had forgotten what spring was like in Kentucky, because I hadn't been there. And so I truly was saying, my tea, I'm standing here, I'm looking out that window, and it was that then triggered the poem. But again, what I discovered, so it was writing about the power of the spring, but again, the insight there was the fact that I had forgotten it, that I was then experiencing it anew. How could I forget that? But we do forget. So that turned out to be really what that poem was about. But sometimes I use, exactly what I'm seeing, but other times it's a memory of something, from nature, if I'm searching for an image, if that's what it's about. But I think one reason that those desert poems are powerful was, again, the immediacy of it, and the fact that I really could stand there and try to articulate something about what I was actually seeing right that minute.
Yeah.
I think it gives it a special power. But I know it's not an accident that most of my images come from things that grow and change. I mean, I think there's a power, the generative power of nature, and then also the fact that the cycle turns, there is loss. And we have to understand that. By the way, looking around this room, you would understand that I really, every year I say, where can I get rid of some of these